Hey, friend. Happy Wednesday. So good to see you. I hope that you are starting off having a strong week as we bulldoze into November. We are officially in the one of the last months of this year, which is, I know, totally mind blowing. I think I'm still somewhere in like the August, September range. So the fact that we are into November is a little scary, but mostly exciting. Hopefully, it finds you feeling very excited and invigorated to bring 2025 to a slam dunk close. If you are new and you are just joining us, welcome. I'm biased, but I like to think that we're a super fun, friendly bunch. As you can see, the chat is kind of where all the magic happens. That's where all the fun is, because as much as myself and Dr. Jud today is going to be providing tips and tricks and tactics, also the chat is where you will find a lot of tips and tricks and tactics, and also just really smart individuals. So if you are new to joining us, I encourage you to lean in, get those fingers to typing and say hello. But if you decide to lean back, relax, eat your lunch, maybe listen to this in podcast form while you walk the dog, do the dishes, fold the laundry, no worries. We are going to be having lots of fun with your little listening ears and filling them with all sorts of helpful tricks and tactics for you to use to better yourself. And the reason that I'm so excited about today's conversation specifically is, you know me, because you're the same way. We go down rabbit holes. And boy, oh boy, a couple weeks ago, did I go down the Dr. Jud rabbit hole. And there's a lot of hole to go down, my friend, because Dr. Jud has a ton of amazing content. His TED Talk, which was called A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, was like one of the top 5 most viewed TED Talks a couple years ago. It's been viewed like over 20 million times at this point. It's really just powerful and super interesting. He has 2 LinkedIn learning courses that are out that are available on the platform, 3 books, and a workbook actually that got released exactly 60 days ago today. So the workbook kind of coincides with one of his books, and that was released August 5th. And today is November 5th. So happy 60-day birthday to the Unwinding Anxiety workbook. And so what I love about Dr. Jud is really kind of getting into those habits. Obviously, there's like big bad habits, alcoholism or, these like giant things. But also, we have a lot of little bad habits. One of the things that he talks about in one of his courses that resonated with me was, dealing with like food rewards and treats and that sort of stuff. And I got a puppy a couple weeks ago. And so the trainer said the same thing to me, like, Kim, you can't be giving a treat for every single thing. And I'm like mother, like daughter, we work well with treats. We work well with food. So I'm really excited to bring on Dr. Jud. So I hope wherever you are, Jeff and Keith and Giacomo and Shelby and just everyone who's here will help me raise their glass of caffeine of your choice and welcome Dr. Jud to our chat. Hi.
Thanks for having me.
I'm like I said, I totally went down your rabbit hole, and what a fun rabbit hole to go down. I'm so curious, like you talk about habits all day, every day. And so is this something that you ever get sick of talking about?
In short, no. I'm so lucky, that my job and my personal life and my clinical practice all kind of line up where it's, it never occurred to me how deep we all are in our own habits and how, most habits are helpful. And some of them become very squeaky wheels and are not so helpful. And it's, this is more than a day job, clinical job. It's more than my lab doing the research on this. This really feels like an essential skill for life. So I love waking up in the morning thinking about how to help people change habits.
Is that something also, like, do you get energized if it's more of like you're studying something and it's more of a big habit, like sort of alcoholism, something that's very tangible, or something that's more amorphous, like perfectionism, or if it's something more in the workplace where we're rewarding, junior managers in a way that's going to be constructive so that they can eventually be senior managers.
I think all of them have their unique challenges. And, I actually learn a lot from my patients and the folks I work with. And so whether it's, somebody who's been struggling with alcohol for 20 or 30 years, or somebody who's trying to quit smoking and they come to me after smoking for 40 years, it's the same fun challenge as somebody who is working with procrastination, in their job, or realizing that they might not have set up the best incentives in their workplace if they're a manager.
Yeah. And I feel like, to Jeff's point, it's a lot of those small things that can seem like at the time, like, oh, whatever, like, sure, it's like a little bit of a bad habit. But it's those things that compile that really form, harmful habits to you individually in a team atmosphere, like at work. I mean, I'm sure that's something that you see a lot of those team dynamics as well when you work with organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a number of them, and they and one of the really interesting things is that people don't even notice them, and that you can have an individual habit that can also become a team habit, which can become a cultural habit. That phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is so true.
Well, and I feel like one of the things that probably, I'm inferring here, I would think would happen in the workplace, I know it certainly happens with me and a lot of my friends, is this perfectionism that perhaps kind of takes over. And I feel like perfectionism is one of those things that it feels so rewarding, like while you're doing it, but in the back of your mind that it's bad and like it leads to stress and burnout. And, so I'm curious, like, how do you think about what is the brain's actual reward? Because you do also kind of know it's like a bad itch that you can't stop scratching.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So perfectionism, and we can use this as an example of how basically any habit is formed, right? There are three key elements to any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. Or from a brain standpoint, it's something has to be rewarding to the brain to repeat it. And so often perfectionism is triggered by someone feeling like, there are a number of reasons that trigger it, but one of the key ones is anxiety, actually, where somebody is like, I'm not going to do this unless I can do it perfectly, which also then triggers a procrastination. So perfectionism and procrastination often go together. But the perfectionism piece can get tied up with somebody's identity around, like, this is going to reflect on me. And in the modern world where it seems like everything becomes permanent because often things land up on the internet somehow or on social media, people feel there's even more pressure to be perfect. And that perfectionism gives the mind something to do. It's interesting because perfectionism is very tied to worry, and similar in that sense, where worrying feels like it's better than doing nothing. And so gives us a feeling of control. And that feeling of control is rewarding enough to feed back and then have us drive those habits more.
So it's really the feeling of control is, in a weird way, the reward, even though it's not, you don't actually have control. It's a mirage.
Right. I think of it as the illusion of control, but the illusion of control is rewarding enough because it feels like we're doing something that it drives future behavior.
I'm glad you brought up the sort of brain science behind, trigger, behavior, reward, that loop, because one of the questions that I had was, to me, it makes sense when it's something very straightforward and sort of like simple. But what happens when it comes to something that's like a little less obvious? So maybe it's like doom scrolling. I know yesterday was like voting for a lot of us here in the United States, like doom scrolling on the internet, or self-criticism. Like, what does that look like then?
Let's start with self-criticism and then roll back to doom scrolling and see how that feeds it. So self-criticism or self-judgment can feel, again, they're often triggered by doing something or having something happen that we didn't want to happen, right? So something doesn't go as well as we'd hoped, let's put it that way. And then we fall into this self-judgment or self-criticism behavior. So this mental behavior of self-criticism, which then says, oh, well, I can't change the past, but I can do something now so I can beat myself up over it. And that gives us that, again, that illusion of control that we're doing something. And on top of it, it gives us this false sense that if we judge ourselves, we're actually going to be better for the future. But the irony here is that self-judgment closes us down and puts us in a fixed mindset so that we're not actually open to learning. And so not only are we getting in the bad habit of beating ourselves up and then modeling that for others, imagine parents who do this in front of their kids or in front of coworker, do it in front of a coworker. We see this in movies, it's like all the hero movies are like, oh, I'm going to be tough on myself. And then suddenly I'm going to, win in the end. Well, that only happens in Hollywood. In reality, the self-judgment just closes us down because when we attack ourselves, we naturally put up our defenses. So our brain is not in a place to learn in that moment. So that's where there are a lot of ironic pieces here. But in fact, without recognizing that this is an unhelpful habit, people just drive that habit deeper and feel like, oh, I need to beat myself up even more. Maybe I'm not being hard enough on myself, which makes it even worse.
And then it's just like, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy that just loops over and over again. I love this question from Jeff when you talked about the past, because I thought that was really interesting. Are a lot of these sort of bad habits, whether it's self-criticism or perfectionism, do you think that a lot of that kind of develops in childhood and it's just something that kind of manifests and gets bigger and bigger as we get older and older and adults and in a workplace? Or do you feel like it's something that also people can kind of come up with when they're 35 and, been working for 20 years?
Yeah. Yes. And I see it in both situations. Yeah. So I remember, it reminds me of a patient who came to me when he was in his 60s, and he had formed the habit of worrying due to childhood trauma, and worrying was the only thing he had control over as a kid.
Right.
And so the way we described it was that he had put on these shoes that he'd worn forever. And he'd not only worn out these shoes, but they no longer fit because his worrying was actually getting in the way of him living a happy, healthy life. And so while this had formed for him in childhood, it doesn't matter when it forms. Certainly these habits can get ingrained. But my lab's even done studies with people who've chronically overeaten. And we find that it only takes 10 or 15 times for somebody to really pay attention to the result of the behavior for them to be able to change that behavior, to step out of it. It's not like it magically disappears and never shows up again, but it doesn't mean that if we've done something for 50 years that it's going to take 50 years to unwind it. And so, for example, for this gentleman, being able to recognize and honor his childhood self, like, okay, I did the best that I could as a kid where he really had very little control, was really empowering for him. And also it helped him, as he put it, really honor his previous self, but also take those shoes off so that he could find a new pair that actually fit.
Well, yeah. And I think that brings a lot of people hope when you said, 10, 15 sessions, because I think exactly what you said. Some people feel like, well, I've had this problem for so long, it's going to take me 5 years to get rid of it. Okay. I just won't even start, kind of like facing the Everest. Like I won't even try to climb because it's going to be too much. But I think when you say things like that maybe somebody joining today was like, well, that does sound doable, or maybe that's not so out of reach for me.
Right. It's true. So if you look at the neuroscience behind this, our brains have to be tremendously plastic to be able to deal with an ever-changing environment. So it doesn't even make sense that we would be very rigid. If you look at rigidity, it's not generally correlated with adaptability. It's kind of the opposite, right? And it's kind of a no-brainer. So our brains are set up for being able to change as quickly as they need to. And they also have good mechanisms in place to be asking questions like, is this a time to change or not? There's this classic problem of explore versus exploit, which were related to food sources, right? If we find a good food source, how long do we stay there versus, finding something that might be better when this food source dries up? So we see, from an evolutionary perspective, our brain has all the mechanisms in place to be able to adapt when we need to. But if we get too locked into our basically a fixed mindset, as Carol Dweck talks about it, that's where we're actually getting in our own way from a survival standpoint. So it's really good good news for all of us to know that we actually are pretty adaptable, and we can leverage some skills for being, keeping ourselves flexible and adaptable. Just like doing yoga or stretching is helpful throughout life to keep our bodies nimble. Things like curiosity and kindness are extremely helpful throughout life to help our minds stay nimble and adaptable.
Well, and I think it's a good reminder as well that, as much as, listen, human nature, we're always focused on ourselves, me. What am I having for lunch? What am I like? How do I feel about this? There's a lot of like I language, which makes sense. But also I think it's encouraging to flip the script and know, okay, if that's true for me, it also means it's true for everybody else, So, to Shelby's question, if you are on a team, or you are at work and you sit with the marketing team or the programming team or the sales team or whatever, and you feel like there's a team habit, or maybe it's a cultural habit at work, it also is encouraging to know that, okay, well, everybody can help shift that and break that. If you recognize that there is something either with your smaller team or your larger team at work, what advice would you give people? Obviously, they're not going to solve it in a day. They're not going to have one day and be like, okay, the problem is solved. But what's like the first 1 or 2 steps that someone could take to help navigate that?
Yeah, in our work over the last decade or so with habit change specifically, we've identified 3 key steps for habit change. And the first is really just being able to recognize what the habit is. If we can't name it, you can't change it. And so from an individual perspective, for example, or this could also be a team, or it could also be a culture. Let's take worrying, for example. And worrying is an interesting one because often we don't think of worry as a behavior. We just think of it as, oh, this is who I am. This is what I do. But in fact, it's a learned behavior. And back in the 80s, a psychologist named Thomas Berkovic suggested that this is actually what drives anxiety habits, which I never learned in residency or medical school, but it was probably the most important thing that I never learned that is actually really helpful clinically. But bringing it back to your question, being able to recognize what the behavior is. So naming it. So is our behavior as a team, is it to, let's just say, to worry about something, and worry is also contagious. So we have to look out for the social contagion that goes with that. But that aside, once we recognize what the habit is, we can leverage the brain's learning system. So habits are the strongest form of learning known in the entire animal kingdom. So that reinforcement learning system, it's critical to be able to leverage the elements of it. And so a behavior is going to get reinforced if it's rewarding to our brain. And the corollary is also true. If we see that it's unrewarding, we become disenchanted with it. And I'll give you an example, like a clinical example, and then we can see how we apply this to teams. So for example, when my patients come in and want to quit smoking, they've tried everything. They've tried Willpower, and if it worked, they wouldn't be coming to see me. So what I have them do is this paradoxical thing where I tell them to go ahead and smoke. And they look at me like, my first doctor that told me to smoke. Well, to be clear, they're already going to smoke anyway. I'm not suggesting that they add more cigarettes to their pack. But what I have them do is pay attention as they smoke. And they come back to me incredulous, like, how did I not notice this before? And they start describing how disgusting cigarettes taste. We see the same thing, and I do this with my patients who overeat. I have them, well, if you're going to overeat, just pay attention as you overeat. You can collect some data. I have people do this when they're worrying. What do you get from worrying? And they see that the typical answer is nothing. And they're like, so why do I keep doing it? Well, this is where the control and all these rewarding processes in the past come into play. And now it's a habit where they're not even paying attention to how rewarding it is. And that's the key. So the second step is really asking a simple question. What am I getting from this? So we can do this as an individual. We can do this as a team, right? So what are we getting when we're catastrophizing as a team? Right. And they can start to see that the catastrophizing actually gets in the way of getting work done, and also tends to waste a lot of energy. It's tremendously inefficient to catastrophize. Right. So that's the second step, where we're leveraging the fancy neuroscience term is we're getting a negative prediction error, where our brain is locked into a habit like, well, I always do this. And we turn on the lights and we help our brain see, oh, this is not rewarding. So it's predicting that it's going to be rewarding, but it's actually not. That's where the prediction error comes in. It's not like there's something wrong. It's just that our brain was not expecting that. And when that happens, we become disenchanted with that old habit. And so here, when we see that it's not helping us, we become disenchanted. And then the third step is, I call this finding the bigger, better offer, is being able to step out of the old habit loop, which can be as simple as not doing the thing. So what leaders of teams can do, and they can start with themselves, first be able to recognize and map out these habit loops clearly, see that these are biologic, these are neurologic. This isn't some fault of the person, right? This is, our brains are just trying to help us survive. Lean into that, and even do this collectively with the team. Like, what are we getting from worrying about this? What are we getting from catastrophizing? And then play with, doing an alternative experiment. What's it like when we don't catastrophize, repurpose all that energy to actually getting the work done, or, risk management, or whatever needs to be done. And that way, that's the 3-step process that breaks free from this. And I can say, we've done randomized controlled trials in our clinic with our anxiety program where we've gotten a 67% reduction in anxiety. This is in people with generalized anxiety disorder, compared to clinical care, which usually is medications or whatever, about 14%. So we're seeing huge reductions when you're targeting that mechanism. And that mechanism, that 3-step process, anybody can use, whether it's as an individual or as a team. And then as the team leans into and learns that, oh, this is a better way of doing things, that's going to become the new habit.
Well, and I think something you touched on, which to me really resonates, is this concept of what's kind of your responsibility, like recognizing what's happening with you. If you want to be in control. I mean, one thing that I really liked, I mentioned it earlier, but Dr. Jud has a workbook that goes alongside the regular book. And one thing that I really personally like about workbooks is it makes me feel like I'm doing something, kind of going back to that little reward of like, okay, I have control. I have like this pen, and a workbook. And I'm, even if I'm not necessarily, okay, you're not solving world hunger or solving world peace, if I'm making myself feel 15% less anxious that, my mother-in-law just asked me about Christmas and I was like, anxiety alert, that makes me feel good. And so I'm so curious, obviously the workbook's only been out for 60 days, but do you find that a lot of people want to physically do something as opposed to, a lot of this being mindful and, really thinking it's not physical in any way?
Yeah. Well, I one reason we put out the workbook was a lot of people were asking for it after I wrote the Unwinding Anxiety book. And so, listen to what people are asking for, and that typically will point somebody in the right direction. And so what I've found is that a lot of people really like just writing things down helps them clarify their thinking. So for a lot of people that can be helpful. For other people, we're already learning, the world changes so quickly. So in our Going Beyond Anxiety program, we've actually built a learning assistant where so we're basically reimagining how anxiety treatment is provided. And so if you think of typical treatment, somebody might go to their primary care physician for a medication, which typically helps about 1 in 5. Somebody might go to therapy. Therapy isn't always accessible. There might not always be a good fit. It can be expensive and things like that. And also, a lot of therapists aren't actually trained in the modern neuroscience. So, for anybody listening to this, go ask your therapist if they can explain to you how anxiety is driven like a habit. And that'll just be one example where they probably didn't learn the same thing that I didn't learn in graduate school. So I mention all of that because we can deliver this evidence-based neuroscience in a very simple way. But in that part, we've been able to do that for a while. But the part that's really interesting is we can pair a learning assistant where this large language model comes in and trained specifically in our material, can do the workbook with them. So where it basically says, okay, explain back to me what you just learned. And what we're learning from that is a lot of folks who might have been my patients or something like that might be reticent to ask the professor or the doctor to re-explain something, or I might not be available to do that. But this thing is infinitely patient, and it can say, okay, teach this back to me. But more importantly, like a workbook, it can move into experiential education. It says, okay, let's move this into your everyday life. And that's why I wrote the workbook. If somebody wants to, and there's something nice about just having a book in your hands. So for people that like that experience, workbooks are great. For folks that are looking for something more interactive, we're really finding things, that there's a way to leverage these large language models. There's a lot of stuff that's not helpful. The stock, I wouldn't recommend an out of the box, chatbot, because they're often trained as sycophants. And I wrote a whole Substack thing on that. I just wouldn't recommend using the entirety of the internet as your therapist, just, to put it mildly. But here's where there's an opportunity to ask somebody, like, what's going to be most helpful for you? Is it a workbook where you're physically writing? Is it having a conversation with something that is well trained to have the right conversation with you? Or is it something more traditional like therapy?
Yeah, I'm actually curious, for anybody who's joining us live, drop in the chat if you're more of a workbook, like pen and paper person, or if you're more of a digital chat box person. I'm curious about that, because it kind of filters into my selfish question, which one of the things that I'm trying to get better about is people have this false perception. I started my own business 15 years ago. So they're like, oh, you're entrepreneurial. Like, you love new things and you're risky. And it's a joke, especially in my household with my husband, because I'm like the opposite. I go to the same restaurants. I order the same sandwich at the sandwich shop and the same soup. I always act like I'm going to order something else. I don't. I get the same. Fernando's like, why are you even looking at the menu? And I'm like, no, today might be different. It's never different. I'm a creature of comfort. He's the opposite. He's like, new restaurant, new things, new. And I'm just more of like a creature comfort kind of gal. And so one of the things that I'm trying to get better at is, I feel like my brain sort of, in a way, like, it rewards comfort. And sometimes it's hard for me to reward failure or reward imperfection. However, I also know that is the fastest way to growth, is like trying new things, failing. And so I sometimes have this war with myself. So even just hearing you say, like, I'm a workbook girl. And so when I hear you talk about, like, oh, this thing, like, my first reaction is like, no, stay with my safe workbook, but then I'm like, no, I must grow. I must try new things. So I'm curious, like, how do you help people reward, I guess, risk or reward failing, really? Because I feel like that's also where growth comes, is you have to, like, fail a lot.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things here that I think you're touching on that are really important. One is, my wife calls this the FGO. So the PG version of this is the frickin' growth opportunity, and you can get the gist of how this goes. But the idea here is, if we, this whole idea of taking 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, I would actually throw that out the window. And that's why I wrote this Substack on it, is that the idea is we can learn from anything. And we often learn more when we trip up and slip up than when we succeed. I literally just an hour ago, I was on with a patient who was talking about shame, and how she was getting stuck in this shame spiral. And then she was describing how she'd done something, and everybody's like, oh yeah, I've done that too. And then I asked her, well, what's it like? Imagine a friend coming through the door and saying they just did this thing, and now you've just done it. And you can be like, I've done that. She described how, what she was trying to do was, like, she's like, oh, I'm going to be cool. And then she's like, well, now I feel connected with people. And then I asked her, well, which one feels better? Trying to be cool, which is a lot of work, and certainly fails for me. But also, how's that compare to being connected? The connection beat it out hands down. So all of that, circles back to really looking at how we can really be exploring this in terms of, what's rewarding for us and where are we getting stuck, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense or
well, yeah, because for me, it's the stuck is on anything that's new. Because in my head, I'm like, it's new. Therefore, I might not be perfect at it,
right.
or I might not know how to do it very well.
Right.
But then once I get over that hump,
right.
And by the way, this can be for like big sort of like esoteric things in work, or very small things like, learning a new, we learned a new system called Notion last year. And at first I hated it, and now I'm obsessed with it and talk about it all the time. So, it's just one of those, it's like this learning curve that getting over that hump sometimes is very difficult.
Yeah. So if you look at the comfort, the creature of comfort, and I'm sorry, I'm a creature of comfort that just climbed into my lap, but the idea here is looking at how we go back and forth between our panic zone and our comfort zone. And in between those two is a growth zone. And so when we're panicked, we can't do anything. Our prefrontal cortex goes offline and we go, oh no. And we run back to the cave that's comfortable and safe. Well, here, if we can learn to lean into discomfort, this is where we can flip the oh no to oh, when we bring in, I think of it as the superpower of curiosity. So we bring curiosity in and we learn to lean into discomfort. We start with small things like, oh, maybe I'll try a different sandwich at the shop today. Even if it feels strange, because anything that is different is to our brain first going to feel dangerous, because our brain says, I don't know if this is poisonous, maybe this sandwich is,
could be a bad sandwich.
Right. So until we've tried it and see that it's okay, this is just different, it's not dangerous, then suddenly it's not different anymore. And we can practice leaning into discomfort as our growth zone. And we develop a critical skill, which is distress tolerance. Right. These Cornel West calls our phones these weapons of mass distraction. Right. And so we are.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I've never heard that.
Yeah,
that's
great phrase.
So good.
So we are so used to training ourselves to distract ourselves. This goes back to your earlier point about scrolling. If we're uncomfortable, there's some way to distract ourselves, and it's 24/7 and it's endless, whether it's social media, whether it's news, whether it's whatever. And we're actually unlearning the skill of being with discomfort. And we need to be able to, it's critical to be able to be with discomfort so we can be in our growth zone, because by definition, doing something new is going to be different. So it's going to feel a little uncomfortable.
Well, yeah. And I feel like it's funny. Giacomo just put something in the chat, and it very much resonated with me, because going back to this silly example, I told my husband basically that I need to get more comfortable with like change and new things and so he's been helping kind of like keep me accountable, whether it's like a silly thing, like order something new off the menu, or when I'm like waxing poetic about something at work and he's like, why don't you try to do this? And so I wanted to touch on Giacomo's question, which is, do you think in order to keep those good habits or try something new, that it's helpful to have another person, a friend, a coworker, a mentor, somebody that lives with you to like keep you accountable? Like, is there value in that? And if so, how can you leverage that person?
Yes. So in short, yes. And I think there are ways that we can leverage that process even more. So for some people, they've got a good accountability partner. It can be a friend, it can be a coworker, it can be a partner. And sometimes those dynamics can get a little wonky, right? So it may not, and if we lean on them too much, there are a lot of dynamics there where we don't want to over leverage things. So here, again, we're playing with how can you leverage technology to be a good accountability partner? And part of that starts with developing trust. So in our I don't want to keep going on and on about this, but in our going beyond anxiety program, these learning assistants are set up specifically to check in with people, to be these accountability partners. But importantly, it begins with people trusting that these things are trained the right way and know what they're talking about. So we begin with the educational pieces and then say, hey, I'm happy to check in with you as an accountability partner. And in short, I think it can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's one of those things where, finding the balance between humans and, chats and, what does that look like, and not getting so buried in your weapon of mass distraction, but also just using it as a helpful guide, I think can really, really be interesting. What do you look at? Like, one of the things that I think is helpful on some of these phones, I know I have it set, I always snooze it, but I do have locks on like my social media. It's supposed to tell me to get off Instagram after 15 minutes. I usually hit snooze and continue to stay on Instagram, but the reminder is there if I'm feeling like good that day. How much is mindfulness and habit formation like an overlap versus when is it not an overlap and it's something that you just kind of end up getting into without realizing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing I think you're touching on here with that snooze button is how often we fall back on this societal, I'm going to call it a habit of willpower, where we think, oh, I'm just going to not do this thing. So it says I should. So one, we first tell ourselves, okay, I'm only going to spend 5 minutes on Instagram. And then of course we blow through that. And then so like, I'm going to set these limits. We set the limits and then we feel like we have no willpower to do that. So if you look at the neuroscience here, there's actually willpower is more myth than muscle. And so for changing any habit, and this is where mindfulness comes in, it actually is critically dependent on awareness. So the more we can start to develop and foster the skill of curiosity, which is really at the heart of mindfulness, at the heart of being curiously aware of something, this is where we can start. So for example, if we have an Instagram habit, we can ask ourselves, what am I getting from this as compared to I need to stop, right?
Yeah. The answer is usually nothing.
Right.
But
exactly.
Cat videos, puppy videos.
Yeah. Right.
Nothing that's helping life.
So there's nothing wrong with a kitten video every now and then. But if we find ourselves procrastinating on something that's important, we're actually going to be increasing our stress levels, where we're going to be medicating ourselves with more kitten videos and then becoming habituated to them. So the key here really is being able to step back and see how whatever the thing isn't helping us. And that's where we leverage the strength of our brain instead of relying on something that's more myth than muscle. And that's where mindfulness can be key, is really just developing the skill. And the nice thing is it ramps up itself the more we see how useful it is, because we see, oh, well, we think about the next time we're about to scroll on Instagram and remember, oh, what was that like last time? And then it's easier to not do it. And then we reflect on that and see, oh, that was actually pretty helpful. And then oh, wow, curiosity was actually helpful in this situation and then in this situation. So then it starts to build on itself, because it in itself doesn't have side effects. Like curiosity is like a superpower.
Well, and I found it's funny. It's the curiosity and then it's the kindness with yourself, which you touched on earlier, because I feel like that's something that I think all of us probably need to get a little better on. Yes. I think that we're all A++ like ninjas on self-criticism and being our own worst enemy, and maybe showing a little more kindness would be something that would be helpful for just about everyone. I'm curious because obviously being like in this work over, 20 plus years, in the private sector, in like clinical studies, but also just, on university campuses with students and individuals, what is a question that you wish that more people would ask you about, habit loops or perfectionism, but they just don't? But you wish that they asked more about it.
Can I have two?
Yes.
So one is why isn't willpower working for me? That's the first one. And that gets at what we just talked about, because everybody's stuck in that. And until they ask the question, why isn't it working? They're going to stay stuck in that. The second question I wish people were asking was, how do I actually understand how my brain works? Not in terms of all of the, synapses and at the microcircuit level, but really nobody is trained to understand how habits are formed. That's the first thing I start with in my clinic. A new patient, I'm going to give them 30 seconds on how habits are formed. Anybody can do that. I even have a short primer video on my Dr. Jud website. It's like, this is neuroscience 101 that everybody should learn, because it not only helps them recognize and identify helpful habits, it also helps them recognize and let go of unhelpful habits. And it also helps them foster and build these healthy habits.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like it's one of those things, you kind of just touched on it in terms of like how systems are set up. Whether that's school systems, work situations, healthcare, how could, in your opinion, like what is one of these societal systems that you think could align better with how habits really work, or how we should be learning? Like, where would you start? I mean, obviously you can't like wave a magic wand and like fix the entire school system, but where's one place that you would start that you're just like, this just doesn't make sense the way we learn about this?
At a high level, I would say it's the self-judgment, shame, and kindness category, where societally there's some lip service, and unfortunately even less now than before, given to kindness and respect and connection. Where there's so much division, people are kind of, the game is to see how much you can divide people and drive them into different camps. Whereas nobody wins that one, as compared to the societally. If we just look at, the common humanity and remind ourselves that we're all literally all on the same planet in this together. And also just how much better it feels to be working as a team, whether it's a small team, a company, a country, or a planet, right? We're still a relatively small team, even if we look at every human on this planet working together, because we are breathing the same air. So here I would say that's the place where I think just hitting a reset button on connection over division would go a long way.
Yeah. And I think I heard a quote the other day that I don't have the answer to this, but it was a Substack post or something talking about how everybody wants a village, but nobody wants to be a villager. That people are talking about, boundaries and the holidays coming up, and, if you don't want to go home, don't go home, or, the Mel Robbins sort of like let them theory. And the Substack was basically taking the other side of that and saying, well, part of being in a village or in a community is like doing things you don't want to do, going to your cousin's wedding, not because you're like, I really want to go to my cousin's wedding, but being like, we're family. So I got to show up to this event and boogie on the dance floor and maybe go home early. And so I feel like that's, when you talk about like community and looking at that a little bit differently. I don't know. I don't have the answer to it, but I thought it was an interesting Substack article.
Well, and I think it's a great exploration for anyone to be, stepping back and reminding themselves, like, what is important for me in life? Like, what are my values? What's my purpose? And it's not about individual hedonism 24/7, right? Because that only gets us onto the hedonic treadmill, which we know where that goes. It just exhausts everyone.
Yeah.
So really stepping back and asking, like, where does happiness come from? Right. And it comes from these small, quote unquote, sacrifices for our families and our friends, where if we look back, and I say quote unquote, because when we look back on it, it actually feels really good to do meaningful things.
Yeah.
As compared to like, I didn't get to go to my whatever hedonic thing that I like to do.
Totally. I mean, people talk about all the time, volunteerism is sometimes more of a selfish act than it is an altruistic one, because you ultimately end up leaving that volunteer experiencing feeling really good about yourself or what you did or how you helped.
Yeah, it's a both and, I would say. Everybody benefits.
Exactly. No, 1,000%. I'm curious. I mean, obviously, you're surrounded by so much literature and so many resources. How do you yourself learn? Like, are you reading a lot of books? I mean, I know books going back to like the chat bots and stuff. I had a friend the other day that was like, what if these authors just stop writing books because like the AIs write the books and whatever? And I was like, oh, it's kind of sad. I'm a book reader, but I'm curious, like, how where do you learn? Is it podcasts? Is it books? Is it videos?
Well, as an academic, I read the scientific papers, but that's kind of boring.
Yeah.
I do listen to some podcasts there where there's useful information. There's a lot of slop out there, so it's hard to differentiate. I don't use a lot of social media because I think that is getting more and more, into the realm of AI generated slop. And so, that's not as helpful, I think, as newsletters used to be. But I think there are some careful, thoughtful folks out there. But most importantly, I think the only way to develop wisdom, and I'd love for people to push back on this, see what I'm missing, but the only way to develop wisdom is through experience. So I think of it as, like concepts in the service of wisdom. You can learn a concept and you can test that concept to see if it's true in your own experience or not. And that's where you develop wisdom. So we get to test the concept regardless. And by having a life experience, and I wouldn't count scrolling on social media as life experience unless we're paying attention and seeing what we're getting from it. So then we can learn from that too. But I would say experience is really underrated, and in terms of where true deep learning comes from.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's not in these things. It's out in the world. It's out with other human beings, which I think sometimes we forget. It's like, I was reading something the other day that was talking about so many people are like taking courses and doing all of this stuff when they should really just start and like make the mistakes sometimes, because you can get lost in the books and the podcasts and the Substacks all about how to do something instead of just like going out and trying to do it.
Yes. As I sit in front of a wall of books, I'm going to strongly advocate for direct experience.
I do love books. I have to say, when my friend was saying that about AI, like, are anybody going to write books anymore? I was like, oh no, I love books. I hope the authors don't just, give up and turn it into AI.
Well, AI doesn't come up with new ideas. It only regresses to the mean. And so, it can certainly help people edit ideas if they aren't good at articulating them. And I'll have to say, as an author, there's something really, it's just the act of just writing, it's impossible to replicate, And so if people have never had that experience, then certainly AI is not going to encourage them to do that. But for those that do love, and I was just talking to an author the other day who talked about like, he just writes, like that's what he has to do. And so I don't think that's going to keep writers from writing. I think it'll just make it harder for people to find the true gems when there's a lot more slop out there.
No, I mean, we're all going to have to be like, instead of like bargain hunting at the thrift store, we're all going to have to be like, we're at good content hunting. We're going to be like a truffle pig going around trying to find a good Substack, being like, where's a good one? Find me a good one. Sniffing around. I love this. Okay. As you know, like, we're really nerdy. We love to nerd out on books and podcasts. And one of the things we love is homework assignments. So if you could give us a homework assignment for the rest of the week and going into the weekend that you feel like would just really help us, what would be your homework assignment for us?
Great question. So one, I would say just start identifying all of your habits, right? So all of them. So whether it's putting on clothes, whether it's making coffee, whether it's worrying, like good, bad, and ugly, like just see how many habits you have, because it's amazing how most of our life is habit. And so we can then bow to our brains in gratitude for seeing like, well, thank you for helping me survive today with all these habits. And the second part of that is to be asking ourselves a simple question. What am I getting from this? And that question helps to separate out the stack of, okay, this is helpful. Keep doing this. This is not helpful. Maybe I can, and just by being able to recognize and start to tap into that reinforcement learning piece, that's going to help people be able to step back and start motivating, do this more, do this less, not in a way of like, I need to, or I should, right? Because that's willpower, but really as a way to learn how their brains work. So that's the homework I would give. And if nothing else, it hopefully just helps people learn how beautiful our brains are, how helpful they are, and actually how we don't have to be a neuroscientist. As a neuroscientist says this, you don't have to be a neuroscientist to learn how your brain works and how to work with it.
No, it's so true. I know you don't spend time on the social medias, which is good. Where can people keep learning from you, keep getting content that you and your team are putting out, and to continue to build their own good habits?
I write a weekly newsletter called Inside the Curious Mind on Substack, and I write that. So that's a good place to stay up on the content. And then I have a website, drjud.com, that's just got a bunch of free content for folks to learn about habits and how the brain works and how to change them.
Brilliant. This has been so fun. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you guys for joining Dr. Jud and I. This was so fun. I tried to get to everybody's questions. I feel like there was like a million. We tried to work as many in as possible, but if you have extra questions that we didn't cover, you can always send me a message, a DM, snail mail, whatever you want. And we can help guide you to a resource that is going to help you out. If this was your first time here, we encourage you to come back. You can always head over to getcoffeewithkim.com and see our full schedule. But we meet here every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So come hang out and bring a friend. Thank you so much, Dr. Jud. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Bye, guys.